Welcome to our session on tips and tricks for presenting intervention virtually for students with word reading difficulties. Wanted to start by introducing myself. My name is Carrie Thomas Beck, and I'm the Director of Literacy for the Consortium on Reaching Excellence in Education. Prior to working for CORE, I was the dyslexia specialist for the Oregon Department of Education. And prior to that, I was a faculty member at the University of Oregon for 10 years, where I directed a reading clinic and also taught literacy courses within the College of Education. In today's session, you will review the instructional components needed to promote word reading success, learn general tips for scheduling and planning virtual lessons, and this includes thinking about length of lessons, grouping students, gathering materials, setting expectations, and maximizing student participation. You'll also identify specific strategies to teach phonological awareness activities, phonic decoding, and provide practice with connected text, all in a virtual format. And finally, you'll learn how to utilize a free downloadable virtual lesson planning template to assist you with your daily preparation of online lessons. First, I just wanted to share a little bit about Pivot Learning, who is sponsoring our presentation. Pivot has over 20 years of experience working with districts to drive continuous improvement. Pivot's mission is to partner with educators to design and implement solutions to their greatest challenges in achieving educational justice. Pivot's committed to improving teaching and learning. CORE is a subsidiary of Pivot Learning, and CORE also has over 20 years of experience working with districts. CORE works with districts to deliver curriculum implementation services aligned with specific high-quality ELA and math instructional materials. Many of you may be familiar with CORE's nationally acclaimed Teaching Reading Sourcebook, as well as the Assessing Reading Multiple Measures textbook. CORE was founded by former California State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Bill Honig, along with Linda Diamond back in 1995. And CORE provides professional learning, both in face-to-face and remote situations. And we provide training along with follow-up site implementation support to improve both literacy and math instruction. At CORE, we believe if the goal is to improve student achievement, there are three key pieces needed to professional learning. One, we need to ensure that teachers have the foundational knowledge based on the science to teach reading and math. Two, that teachers have research-based instructional tools, both curriculum and assessments, in their hands. And three, that teachers receive job-embedded support. As we get started with today's topic, I want to send a special thanks to Margaret Goldberg. Margaret is a colleague of mine at CORE, but she's also currently serving as a first grade teacher in a Title I school in a large urban district in California. So Margaret has been teaching first grade every day in a virtual format and has learned a lot of tips and tricks that she was kind enough to share with me. That I'll be passing along to you in this session. I also want to say thanks to the Collaborative Classroom. Collaborative Classroom is a partner of CORE's, and we've partnered with the Collaborative Classroom to develop professional development in California districts since 2016. And as part of this partnership, CORE helps districts in California implement a program called SIPS, which stands for Systematic Instruction in Phonological Awareness, Phonics, and Sight Words. And SIPS is a program that can be used as part of the core reading instruction or as an intervention for students experiencing reading difficulties. And many of the instructional examples that I'll share with you in this presentation utilize materials from the SIPS program. So when planning your instruction for a virtual format, the goal is you want to make that online instruction as much like the in-person teaching as possible. Try to simulate real life learning. So you need to figure out how to replicate how you present your intervention in your classroom to this virtual format. Margaret tries to share her screen as little as possible during the lessons so students can actually see her face when presenting the activities. She also tries to minimize going back and forth between screen share and teacher view in order to save instructional time. Some other things to keep in mind is when you're teaching virtually, you want to continue to provide that same systematic and explicit teaching that you present in your classroom. You especially want to focus on using your most clear, concise, and consistent instructional language when you're teaching virtually. You want to keep your learning structure and your learning routines predictable and simple so students can focus on learning the new content and not get confused or distracted by those routines that you present. You want to ensure that your intervention focuses on those critical instructional pieces that are most beneficial for students who experience word reading difficulties. And in our first series, in this webinar series, we talked about David Kilpatrick's formula for word reading success. So back in 2015, David Kilpatrick essentially reanalyzed all of the reading intervention research out there. And through that reanalysis of the research, identified 3 key components to a formula for word reading success. And these components include making sure that we provide instruction on phonemic awareness and teach phonemic awareness to the advanced level, that we teach and reinforce phonic skills and phonic decoding, and that we provide ample opportunities for students to apply these developing skills in reading connected text. So this formula for word reading success will be the focus of our tips and tricks as we move forward and think about presenting lessons in a virtual format. So as we begin, let's think about some general planning tips first. And these general planning tips will address things like what is the length and the frequency of your sessions, how will you group students, how will you gather materials, set expectations, elicit student responses, as well as how will you maximize student participation. So let's talk about each one of these in turn. So first of all, thinking about lesson length and lesson frequency. So you need to focus on a specific set of learning objectives, and you're going to have limited time to do this. Ideally, if you can, and you're working with groups of younger children, go ahead and try to divide your lessons into 15 to 20-minute segments. So students then would actually be meeting with you more than once per day. So they might meet with you in the morning and then again right after lunch to complete their reading lesson for that day. With older students, it seems to work okay to do 30 all the way up to 50-minute segments for intervention. Of course, you want to meet with them every day if possible, but 4 to 5 days a week, kind of as your goal for that. Now, I will say that Margaret does schedule 30 to 35-minute sessions with her first grade students for intervention. And she does this because she's found it challenging for students to log in for instruction. So she wants to keep them while she has them and not chance losing them for the second session of a lesson. So she does, of course, include plenty of stretch breaks throughout her lesson to keep them engaged. If you do have the opportunity to segment your lessons into shorter chunks, there are a couple of ways that you can do this. One is if you can divide it up into 3 sessions of about 10 to 15 minutes each. In the first session, you could work on the phonological awareness parts of the lesson, along with the phonics part of the lesson where you're working on decoding words, and maybe even squeeze in rereading a previous story. And then in your second short session, you could introduce and review the irregular words, read the new story, and then reread that new story for fluency building. And in a third session, really focus on guided spelling and rereading some previous stories. You have a second way that you could segment your lesson, and this would be by just chunking it into 2 15-minute sessions. And in the first session, you can see that you could focus on phonological awareness, your phonics and decodable words, and reading a previous story. And then in your second session, introduce and review your irregular words, work on guided spelling, and then focus on your new story along with the repeated reads of that new story. Again, it's going to be up to you in terms of what will be feasible. You do, if you segment your lessons, want to ensure that every session would include work at both the word level as well as work with connected text. And as you're making the decision about whether or not to segment your lessons, think again about the grade level of your students, the focus level of your students, when making that decision. Let's talk a little bit about group size now. For younger students, ideally, you'll want to limit your group size to 4 to 6 students if possible. For older students, it's what we're finding is that having groups of up to 8 students does seem feasible. What you want to think about when you are determining your group sizes is you want to make sure that the group size allows you as teacher to see all students in your gallery view on that virtual platform that you're using. And you'll also want to think about, again, the grade level and the focus of your students. Margaret also suggests that you take into consideration the student's home environment and the amount of distractions they have at home. So if you have students who have in that home environment with more distractions, having a smaller group size will likely work better in that circumstance. And Margaret does have groups of 7 students with her first grade intervention students. And this has worked well for her. She said that she is able to manage the audio with this configuration and keep students focused. So the next sort of general planning tip is to think about gathering your teacher materials. Now, you'll want to begin by thinking about what is your whiteboard going to look like in a virtual environment. You may choose to use a digital whiteboard or a regular handheld whiteboard. You also may find that in parts of the lessons, you actually prefer using a pad of paper or a clipboard with the papers that you need displayed. You'll need to figure out how you're going to introduce those new letter sound correspondences. So will you use handheld cards for introducing those letter sounds? Or will you be displaying those sounds electronically? That'll be up to you. Most programs also include sound spelling cards. So again, you're going to need to think about how you'll be displaying those. Will you be holding them up individually? How will you be displaying those sound spelling cards in your virtual classroom so that you not only are organizing them and students can see them, but also you're able to access them easily while you teach? And I wanted to share Margaret's setup in her virtual classroom. So you can see that behind her, she has a pocket chart. And she has placed all of those sound spelling cards in the pocket chart so she can point to them while teaching. She can grab one from the pocket chart and hold it up to the screen so students can see it up close as well. So think about how you're going to display those sound spelling cards in your virtual classroom. Also, in your lesson, you'll be working on word reading, both decodable words and irregular words. So you're gonna have to think about how you'll be displaying those words. Will you write those words on a whiteboard to display, or are you going to want to go ahead and display those words on your screen? And then finally, you will be practicing in connected text with students. So you'll have to think about gathering those stories for students and how you'll display them. So will you display digital versions of those stories from the publisher? And there are some other ways that you can share those stories as well. And we'll talk about those as we move forward in our session today. As far as gathering student materials, you want to check with caregivers to make sure that students have something that they can write on. So this may be a whiteboard with a dry erase marker. This may be that you have handouts that they're inserting in page protectors to write on with a dry erase marker. Or it may just be simply ensuring that students have paper and pencil at home available during the online lessons. You will want to think about providing a hard copy of the sound spelling cards. And I'll show you an example of how one publisher has created PDFs of one-pagers where they reduce all of the sound spelling cards so students can see several on one page and have them in front of them while they're working on spelling. You're going to want to think about how you will provide lists of regular and irregular words to students to have at home. You're going to want to check to see what your publisher has available for easy download for you for materials to send home. And so specifically when you're putting together your send home packet, think about, can you send home page protectors? And Margaret stresses that the glossy page protectors actually work the best for writing on with dry erase markers because they erase easier. Or if you can send home those really inexpensive whiteboards, so each student has a whiteboard and then send home a dry erase marker. You're going to want to think about your phonological awareness activities and what kind of manipulatives you want to send home in that packet. This might be colored cubes or colored blocks. It might be bingo chips, or those types of things that students can use to represent individual sounds in those activities. You'll want to think about, can you send home flashcards that have the letter sound associations, or maybe even just index cards so students can make their own flashcards? Then, like I mentioned above, can you send home packets that have the PDF of the sound spelling cards, the word lists from your lessons? And also, if your program has guided spelling sheets, can you send home copies of the guided spelling sheets for students to put in the page protectors? And finally, if your intervention program includes a student book, can you send that home if possible? Because that will likely be your best bet in terms of students having what they need. All right, I want to move on and talk about setting expectations for your virtual lessons. So you want to think about ways to promote student accountability during these lessons, and having students help take attendance daily and tracking attendance on a chart is one great way to do this. So what I have here is an example of an attendance chart that Margaret has set up. This is for her Blue group. And Margaret got the idea for this attendance chart from the University of Florida Literacy Institute's Virtual Teaching Hub. And I'll show you the web address for that hub in just a second, because I want to make sure you know how to access it. But what Margaret does is every day before they start the lesson, she has the students help her take attendance. And she shows them the stickers, and these stickers also came from the University of Florida, their website. So each student gets to choose a sticker from the sticker page, and then Margaret drags and drops that sticker into the student's attendance chart for that day. So highly motivating activity to start the lesson and reinforcing the students for attending, which is fantastic. So let me show you where you can access the UFLI materials. So this is a screenshot of the homepage for the UFLI, University of Florida Literacy Institute Virtual Teaching Resource Hub. So you can see the web address is at the bottom of the slide. And if you go to this website, you will find everything that you need to teach a virtual reading lesson. Anything from attendance charts and stickers, to a template for planning your lesson, to the actual slide templates that you need for teaching each part of your lesson. I highly recommend that you go check the site out. I promise you that you will find something on that site that will help you teach your virtual reading lessons. So go check it out, and I'll share some more examples from their site as we go in this session. Okay, so another way that Margaret sets expectations with her students is she has them complete a materials check before starting the lesson. And what she does is she actually shows them a photo of the materials that they'll need for the lesson. So here's an example from the SIPS lesson that she's working on with a particular group. And you can see that the students will need their guided spelling sheet and a page protector, and they need a dry erase marker, and they'll need the actual little white eraser along with their list of sight words and their sound spelling card list. So she goes through this at the beginning of the lesson and makes sure that students have everything for that particular lesson nearby. The other thing that Margaret does to set expectations is she creates a visual schedule, and she uses the schedule to share the learning objectives for that lesson with the students, and also to have the students help her check off each activity as they complete it during the lesson. This is a resource that also came from the UFLI site. So here's an example that Margaret used recently. And so it's her virtual schedule for this particular lesson. And you can see that they start with phonemic awareness activity. They move on to teaching sounds, working on word reading in a mixed list, working on their sight words, etc. And then next to each lesson activity is the box where students get to check off once they've completed it. And you can see that Margaret is using those same fun stickers for students to check off those boxes as they complete each activity. And as you can imagine, it's highly motivating for students, not only to check off those activities, but also to use those stickers. So when you're thinking about what are your expectations for the lesson, you also want to teach very explicitly what those behavioral expectations are for the virtual environment. And as you're thinking about this, think about what are the behavioral expectations right before the lesson starts, during the lesson, and after the lesson. So, for example, as Margaret thought about this for her first grade groups, before the lessons, she knew that students had to have the lesson materials nearby. During the lesson, her expectations were that the students stayed in one spot. Now, this didn't have to be a chair. It could be sitting on the floor, but they needed to stay in one spot. They needed to be looking at the screen, and they needed to follow teacher directions the first time. And so in terms of expectations for after the lesson, now here's where you might have expectations in terms of completing work. and submitting it to the teacher. Excuse me, I also wanted to share a tip, and this one came from Anita Archer, where she suggested having students ask a guest to join them at the end of a lesson as a time for the student to show off one new thing that they learned or worked on during the lesson. And I really liked that idea as well. Here is an example of behavioral expectations that Margaret shares with her first grade students. And the images, she likes to use this visual to help students learn these behavioral expectation. And these images came from the UFLI site. But here, the same behavioral expectations we just talked about: stay in one spot, look at the screen, follow directions the first time, and have materials nearby. So Margaret can display these behavioral expectations at the beginning of each lesson as a way to get started off on the right track. So thinking about getting started with the actual teaching in your lesson, a few things I wanted to point out. When you're teaching, introducing something new or reviewing, when you're leading the presentation, you want to make sure that you mute students as you're modeling and providing instruction to block out extraneous noise from the student surroundings and allow for your teacher voice to be clearly heard. As you know, as we're all working and learning from home, there will be background noise. Expect it, embrace it, it's okay. But realize that when you're teaching, you really need the students to hear you clearly. So utilize that mute button when you're presenting. The other thing that Margaret utilizes during her teaching is she uses Zoom, and she uses the spotlight feature in Zoom. And what Spotlight does is it enlarges the teacher's window when the teacher's presenting. So the students see the teacher's frame as the large frame on their video screen, and all of the student videos are small at the top or the side of their screens. And then similarly, Margaret will spotlight a student's frame when a student is having an individual turn to read a sentence or read a word list. And she found that that really helps keep the students accountable when they're spotlighted during their turns. All right. So as you've probably started teaching your virtual lessons, you've figured out that it's impossible to get a true unison response virtually. So you're going to have a decision to make as you're teaching. One option you can use to elicit choral responses is to actually mute students during those choral responses. So essentially, as you're doing this, you would be watching the student mouths carefully and pausing for each student response, then providing a confirmation or affirmation of the correct response. If you're choosing to use this option, the teacher must follow each task with individual turns to check for mastery. So the tricky part about this is if you are using Zoom as your platform, the host can't unmute participants once they're muted. So teachers will have to show students how to unmute themselves. So that's one thing to think about. Your other option is to go ahead and ask students to respond together without muting, understanding that the internet's going to make it impossible for them to answer together, and it's going to create some overlap and some delays with their responses. And this is the option that Margaret has utilized with her online lessons. And she's selected this option because she's found that there's no sense of accountability from her younger students when they're muted and they're asked to respond. She has found that their engagement goes down when they see that they've been muted, And they often respond to the instruction like they're watching a TV show, and they become distractive or passive or may even act out. So she goes ahead and asks students to respond chorally, and she's found that she's able to hear mistakes in spite of the overlap and delays with those choral responses caused by the internet. And so she still is able to give corrective feedback in this situation. So as you're making a decision about which option to go with, consider your group size, consider their grade level, consider that particular group's ability to focus, and think about the tasks themselves when deciding how you're going to elicit student responses. A lot of it will be trial and error as you figure out what works best for each of your groups. All right, some other thoughts about maximizing student participation. So as we just talked about, you want to utilize choral responses so that students have frequent opportunities to respond, even if those choral responses are not perfect and they're a little bit messy in our virtual environment. But the other things to think about is you want to activate multiple modalities. So hearing, seeing, speaking, and writing throughout your virtual lessons. So obviously students will have many opportunities to hear and see the content when you present it virtually. So when you're planning, you really want to focus on ways that you can incorporate more opportunities for students to respond through speaking and writing. And I have some other ideas too for how they can respond. Be creative. So for example, can students do a thumbs up or a thumbs down for some of their responses? A smile if they agree, or a frown if something doesn't look right or they disagree. They can shake their head yes or no, or have a flashcard that says yes on one side and no on the other that they could hold up. They could hold up letter cards for sounds. So if they have some letter sound flashcards at home, you could say, everybody show me and they could hold up their card and show you You could also have them use their fingers to indicate sounds in words or syllables in words, just like you do in the classroom. So all ideas that you can use to maximize student participation in that virtual format. So let's move on now and talk about some specific strategies for how to teach phonological awareness activities, your phonic decoding, as well as providing practice with connected text in a virtual format. So starting with your phonological awareness activities. So one thing I'll share is that Margaret uses her regular whiteboard when presenting phonological awareness activities virtually. And she simply holds it up in front of the camera so students can see it. And one of the benefits of doing this is that students can also see her mouth when she's presenting these phonological awareness tasks. That's a huge benefit to keep in mind. So we have to think about how can we still provide some scaffolding in that virtual format. So how do we have scaffolding that makes sounds more concrete for students in a virtual environment? And one thing I'm just going to remind you about is, just like when you're teaching phonological awareness in the classroom, when you're doing it virtually, remember to always have the students repeat the word before they complete the phonological awareness task. They need to repeat that word to make sure that they heard it accurately, that they can say it accurately before you have them actually manipulate sounds in that word. So what I want to do right now is I want to just share some really simplistic virtual templates that I developed for some of our most highly utilized phonological awareness tasks. And let me just show you how I use them. So here is a very simple virtual template that I developed on a slide for phoneme blending. And basically it would go like this. I'll say some sounds. You blend the sounds together to make a word. Listen. Rap. What word? Yes, rap. So that's something you could use for phoneme blending. For phoneme segmentation, again, a very simple template that I made on a slide. I'll say a word. You tell me the sounds in the word. Listen, rap. Say it. Say the sounds in rap. Yes, the sounds in rap are r, a, p, rap. The UFLI site has a really wonderful template for a say it and move it activity to work on phoneme segmentation. I know a lot of you have used this activity in your classroom. So when you download it, you'll get a slide that looks just like this. And if you display the slide in your normal setting for PowerPoint, you'll be able to complete the same task that I just did for phoneme segmentation, but actually be able to pick up and drag each of these colored circles to represent a sound in a word. Because I'm in slideshow format, I'm not able to manipulate these shapes, but if you're in just the normal slide view, you'll be able to do that. So again, this would be for phoneme segmentation, say the sounds in rap and just drag a colored circle for each sound as students say it. So now let's talk about some templates you can use virtually for your advanced phonemic awareness tasks. Remember, one of the components of our formula for word reading success is to make sure that when we teach phonological awareness, that we teach it to the advanced level. So this is a very simple template that you can use for teaching Phoneme Addition virtually. And this is a template that I adapted based on an activity from the SIPS program. And just so you know, and this, you teach this to the students ahead of time, a box indicates a part of a word that's larger than a sound, and then a line would represent an individual sound. All right, so let me show you what this activity looks like. So listen, say rice, add p, new word, yes, price. Okay, let me do it one more time. Say rice, add p, new word, yes, price. Okay, now let's take a look at a simple template that you can use for phoneme deletion. Let me demonstrate. Say twin, say twin, drop t, new word, yes, win. Okay, so all I did was a very simple animation on my slideshow where I just added an X to show them that they were deleting the t in the word twin and that they're left with just win. Right, super easy to do, and I think a pretty powerful way to teach this virtually. Now here's my very simplistic template for a phoneme substitution task. So again, this one, I'm going to use the wording based on an activity from the SIPS program. And it would look something like this. Say ran, change r to t. New word, yes, tan. And so all I did for this slide template is, again, I did a very simple animation where I just turned the green circle to a yellow circle. And that's a scaffold to help students see that in this particular phoneme substitution task, that we're focusing on changing the first sound. We're changing the first sound from r to t. Okay. So now that we've talked about how you can teach your phonological awareness activities virtually, let's talk a little bit about teaching your phonic decoding parts of your lessons virtually. And usually the phonic decoding parts of your lesson have several different components to them. You are likely to be teaching letter sound associations, working on some sound by sound blending, working on word reading with regular words, and working on irregular word reading, and then, excuse me, including some encoding activities as well. So one thing I will say about the phonic decoding part of the lesson, this is the one section of the lesson that Margaret teaches almost identically to how she would teach in person. So she's not using a ton of screen sharing here. She's really focusing on using her in-person teaching techniques. I'll show you what I mean. So let's start by introducing and practicing sound symbol associations. So for this section of the lesson, Margaret just uses the handheld sound symbol cards and literally holds them up to introduce them and as well as to practice them. And this type of just old-fashioned classroom teaching works well in the virtual format because, again, students will be able to see Margaret's mouth when she's modeling those new sounds, but also it allows her to easily put those sounds that students made errors on after she corrects them back into the pile so that she can cycle through those again. And it is possible to do that digitally using your screen, but it's just a little bit more tricky. So this old-fashioned way seems to work really well for teaching and practicing sound symbol associations. So when Margaret moves to teaching sound by sound blending, again, she sticks to having the students see her. And what she does in this case is she prints out the word lists from the lessons from the publisher's site. And she displays them on a clipboard. And that way she can just use her finger to slide under each sound as the students sound out the words. And then also can then go back and point to each word as students are reading the words the fast way. The other option would be to display word lists on the screen and use your cursor to slide under the sounds in the words and to point to the words. Margaret has tried this, but she's found that it's harder to kind of annotate the lesson as she goes. And what I mean by that is as she's teaching, she's trying to mark down the words that the students make errors on so she can review those in the next lesson. But also it makes it harder to provide scaffolding on the spot. So for example, if students read a word and they make an error, one way she can scaffold is she can cover up the word ending with her fingers, have the students just work on reading the base word, then go back and read the word with the ending. So it's again, not impossible, but trickier to do that when you're displaying words digitally. So if you are interested though in using your screen to display the words, this is definitely a possibility. And if you use Chrome as your browser, you can install a custom cursor plugin like custom cursor for Chrome to both enlarge your cursor and point to words when you're doing sound by sound blending or word reading. And so what it might look like, and you can see here, there's all sorts of options of either like pictures of animals or simple finger pointing or arrows. So what it might look like, here I downloaded the words from a lesson from SIPS, and I could use either the finger pointing cursor or I could use that yellow arrow cursor to point for this activity. One other option is you can actually increase the size of your cursor on your computer. So if you're a Mac user, what you would do is you would go to your settings and you would find accessibility. And then once you click on accessibility, you would click on display and then select cursor up here from the menu. And that will allow you to use this sliding scale to adjust your cursor size. So you can see that I have enlarged the size of my cursor for today's presentation. And it helped when I was demonstrating those phonological awareness tasks. And it would also help tremendously for word reading. So let's move on and think about the section of your lesson where you're teaching sight words or teaching irregular words. So Margaret introduces and reviews her sight words in the lesson by using her whiteboard and the handheld cards that have the sight words on them. Again, she's found that this works best for this section of the lesson. But Margaret also provides students with a list of their sight words from the lesson, and she sends that home with students. And she also sends home the sight words on flashcards that are printed out, and students cut them out and just make them into flashcards. And let's see, Margaret watches students. Let me backtrack. So students use the flashcards to practice at home. And Margaret will often ask students to use those flashcards to actually hold up and show her how she reads those sight words for her as a way for them to have individual turns. Sometimes she'll even have them record themselves practicing the read, spell, read on those irregular words and submit those recordings to her. This is an example of a sight word dictionary that a publisher provides for SIPs that Margaret sends home for her students. And let's go ahead and move on and talk about how you would teach the encoding activities in the virtual format. So as I mentioned earlier in the session, if possible, you want to provide students with a PDF of the sound spelling chart so that they'll have those sound spellings in front of them as they're working on the spelling activities within the lessons. So again, the publisher for the SIPS program offers this wonderful resource for teachers so that they can send home with their students. And so this is just one page of the sound spellings, and the students have a couple of pages that get sent home so that they can see these as they're spelling. Margaret also has some color versions of the sound spelling cards that she can display on her screen. Here are the sound spellings for the short vowel sounds. And again, just something that Margaret mixes in as appropriate when they're working on their encoding activities. So as students are working on these encoding activities at home, they are going to need some type of whiteboard, or it could be just paper and pencil. What Margaret does is she sends home those guided spelling sheets that I will show you an example of, and then has students put them in a page protector and just use a dry erase marker and an eraser so they can use the same guided spelling sheet again and again and again. One thing you want to think about doing is teaching the students to hold up their spelling so that you can do immediate checks and provide immediate corrective feedback. Another idea as a way to sort of wrap up practice on spelling is utilizing the chat box. So you could ask students, for example, to find the letter that makes the sound t, type t in the chat box. Or you could use a similar activity for word dictation. Type rip in the chat. Say rip. Think about the sounds in rip and type each sound. Okay, so just kind of a fun way to add an extra practice activity at the end and utilize that technology. Here's the example of the guided spelling sheet that's provided by the SIPS program that Margaret sends home. So let's move on and talk about the third part of that formula for word reading success. We've talked about teaching phonological awareness and teaching it to the advanced level. We've talked about teaching phonic decoding and all of the pieces of that part of the lesson. So let's finish up by talking about how you can modify your lesson to provide practice for students in reading connected text. So you have a lot of different options for how you can display connected text. So many publishers offer PDFs of the stories from their program that you can just download and display. You could scan story pages. You could take photos of story pages, and you could, even if you are working with shorter stories, retype the sentences from the stories into slides or into documents. You do want to send hard copies of the text home with students, whether you're sending home their storybooks or the copies of the PDFs of the stories, because you want to ensure that in addition to having practice reading stories from the screen, that they also have practice reading stories from their paper copies, whether they're books or printed out onto paper. So here's an example of one of the stories that is in the SIPS program that teachers can display on the screen. And I wanted to point out that the SIPS program also offers an app that parents can download onto their tablets or computers or even their phones and download all of the stories that come with the program so that they can read the stories right from their devices. So that's a really, really handy app that is a nice addition to this program. Okay. So as you're displaying your stories on your computer screen, one thing you can do is to show the students how to use the eraser end of a pencil as a pointer so that they can track the words as they're reading them on the screen. It might look something like this. If parents are hesitant about having students touch their screen with anything, which is understandable, you can just show students how to hover their finger under the words and not actually touch the screen, but still be able to successfully track words on the computer screen. Okay, just like using a custom cursor or the enlarged cursor when you're working on word reading, you can also use that fancy cursor as you're tracking the text for stories on the screen. Another thing, and this is a Margaret tip, is that if you display your slides or your Word docs in editing mode, you as teacher can actually highlight words or sounds within words when you're showing the stories to pre-correct for tough words or to go back and revisit words perhaps that students made an error on. And so I just retyped that same story we just looked at into a slide. And when I show my slide in just the normal slide view, I can go ahead and highlight on the spot. Let's take a look at this blend at the beginning of the word. Let's say the sounds in the blend. Okay, let's sound out the whole word. Okay, so same thing as if there's a tough word in the story and you know that this was a tough word from working on your word reading, you could actually have students sound out and read this word before you actually start the story reading together as a group. So that's a nice trick to keep in mind. When you're doing story reading virtually, be careful that you don't get tempted into leading the students through all of the text reading. If you're teaching a mastery-based program, and what you would expect is that these stories will be at the student's instructional level. So they should be quite successful with reading these stories on their own. So let them do the reading on these story reads. Don't lead them through it. And remember, our goal with our instruction is always to provide as many opportunities as possible for the students to respond. So what this means for story reading is you want students to be chorally reading as the way to accomplish that. So there are a lot of ways to do this choral read of stories. Just as we talked about in the beginning of the session, you may decide that you want to ask students to mute themselves, and then you would just prompt them through the story. So everybody touch the first word in the first sentence, read the first sentence, and then you would pause, touch the first word in the next sentence, read the next sentence. So that would be one way you could do it while students are muted. If you do this, when you're working with shorter stories and earlier readers, what you'll want to do is confirm the sentence after each sentence. So you ask the group to read the sentence and you would say, yes, the dog ran home. Okay, so confirm after they read each sentence so that they hear the correct sentence. The other option would be to go ahead and not mute the students. And when you do the first read, you could go ahead and just ask them to do a whisper read. And again, depending on the length of your story, the skill level of your group, you could do it a sentence at a time, or you could have them read the whole story as a whisper read. So that would be your first read. And then what you'll want to think about next is doing repeated reads to build fluency. One nice way to do this, and this is a trick that you see Anita Archer doing all the time, whether it's in person or virtually, is to add in that close reading technique as a way to provide another round of practice with the story. And what we mean by that is basically the teacher would read some of the words in a sentence and pause and let students then read the missing words. So the teacher might say the dog ran, and then pause and let the students read that word home. So that's kind of a fun and engaging way to reread a story with the group. And you could pause and let students read one word, 2 words, 3 words. You could even just say the first word or 2 of the sentence and let students finish the rest of the sentence together. So just again, like in real life in your classroom, you're going to want to follow your group story reads with individual turns, because your individual turns are really your way to check on student mastery. When you call on individuals, if you have a lot of students in your groups, in your group who are making errors, that means that the group is not firm and that you want to go back and provide additional instruction and practice for the entire group. We talked about one quick and easy way to start your fluency building, and that would be through that close reading activity. But you're going to want to build in more fluency building on the day's story. So when you're in your classroom, you often are likely to incorporate partner reads, and you can certainly do this virtually too. You can assign students partners, you can put them into breakout rooms, and then go ahead and pop in and listen to pairs read and check on progress within those breakout rooms. The goal is you want students to read the story 2 times, the whole story 2 times, and then have that opportunity to hear the student read the story. So what Margaret does is she asks the student to read the story 2 times, and then she asks the student to actually record the story to her as an assignment so that Margaret can listen to the student read the story. And I have an example here for you. So here's a student who's doing her recording. This was likely to be like her 3rd or 4th read of the story from today's lesson. And you can take a listen.
The Lost Cat Part 2. Anne fed Muff lots of milk. She let Muff get up on her bed. Sam said
Okay, so you can see how well that worked. And Margaret has the students record their fluency practice on Seesaw and then submit that to her so she can listen. So that's a great way for teachers to be able to listen to students. And it doesn't have to be during the lesson itself. It can be submitted for Margaret to listen to later. The other option I wanted to share that Margaret will often ask students to do is a reader's response as a way to follow up on the story reading. So she either has students do the response digitally, or she'll just have them do it paper pencil. And so this is a response from one of her first graders, Cooper, who read a story about an ostrich. So he drew a picture of an ostrich with an egg. And he said, I learned they can't fly, and they're 8 feet tall, and they lay their nest in sand, I believe is what Connor shared. UFLI on their site has a really nice list of free sources of decodable, or of text, connected text that you can access. So I have the exact web address here at the bottom of the slide, and you can see all of these different links where you can go and access free stories, free connected text that you can share digitally. All right, as we're wrapping up today, just like when you're teaching in the classroom, you want to be carefully monitoring student responses and providing corrective feedback throughout your whole lesson. So as we're thinking about how to best do that virtually, you want to try to ask for choral responses whenever feasible. We talked about the pros and cons of that. You do want to get into the habit of providing affirmations following each task to confirm those correct responses, because what students will be hearing is a lot of garbled, delay, overlap responses. So it might not be clear to them what the correct response is. So you always want to get into the habit of prompting the students, first word, what word? Pausing, and then confirming, yes, that word is RAM, so that they always hear that clear, correct answer. Also, as I mentioned earlier, you want to follow each group task with individual turns as a way for you to double check on mastery. You can unmute students one at a time, and remember, you can use the spotlight to make their screen the large screen while it's their turn. It is going to be a little bit more difficult to provide corrections virtually, but do correct on the spot. Margaret says that she is able to hear errors when the students are responding chorally. She may not catch every single one, but she is hearing errors, and so she's able to correct on the spot. But also make note of those the errors that students are making, and plan to review that content on a whiteboard in the next session or in the next day when you meet with the students again. Do keep a close eye on the students' mouths, especially as they complete the phonological awareness activities, because that will be a big clue to you whether or not they're completing the tasks correctly. And do remember to ask students to hold up their spelling work, so you can keep an eye on their writing as well. Also, when you're teaching the spelling part of the lesson, remember to display your whiteboard to show the correct response, or you can display the word on your screen to show the correct response, so students can get immediate corrective feedback on their writing as well. Okay, so as we wrap up today's session, I did want to share a planning tool with you, because as you plan for how to teach these lessons virtually, you're going to have to think ahead. And if you have some sort of template or planning process, I think it'll help you be more efficient with that. So you'll be examining your regular lesson in the teacher guide and taking a look at the corresponding student materials that go along with the program. And what I suggest is thinking kind of through this process. So you're going to think, okay, what is the lesson activity as written? What is the purpose of it? What does it look like in a nutshell? Then think in your head, what are the look fors from a teacher perspective? And I mean, from a teacher presentation perspective, what should I be doing to make sure that I present this part of the lesson effectively? And then finally, think about, what do I need to keep in mind based on all of that to present this part of the lesson virtually? So this is a template that Margaret came up with and has worked well for her. And so as you can see, it's just the way I described it. In the first column, you would list each of the activities in your lesson, like phonological awareness as the first activity, and then maybe you move on to the word reading or decoding section, etc. And you would write, what's the purpose of that activity and the description? What are the look fors? What's key in terms of teaching this activity, and how will you modify or adapt it? I do have an example, and this is for the story reading section of a lesson. So the purpose of story reading is for students to have the opportunity to read connected text accurately with comprehension. And just a brief description, the group is going to read a new story poster, and then students use the sound spellings and sight words they know to corally read a story. So that's just a brief description. So what are the key look fors? We want the teacher using crisp, clear pointing to the words in the story. We expect a choral student response. The teacher is not reading the story, the students are reading the story. At this particular lesson, at this point in the program, students are sounding out and then reading each word in the story. And the teacher uses the wall cards as a way to provide strong corrections. So what does that mean in terms of modifying this for a virtual presentation? Some of the things to think about is, in this case, the teacher is going to display the digital story on the slide and use the custom cursor to focus students on each word in the sentence. And the teacher made the decision to do a choral read without muting, and followed by individual turns to read a sentence. So you can take these adaptations and even put them on Post-its and annotate your teacher guide so that you don't forget to do these things, like remember to add extra individual turns and things like that. But that's the way this template works. And we've made this template available for you to download. So please feel free to use it if you think it will be helpful, or just, utilize this process, even if you decide not to utilize the template itself. So reflecting on what we just talked about, there was a lot we just went through. When you think about your own student groups and the interventions that you're currently implementing, I want you to choose one group to focus on. And think about, what is one general tip or trick from today's presentation that you can implement with that group in particular? Maybe it's the attendance chart, or maybe you're thinking about writing out your behavioral expectations and how you'll display those. Okay. Maybe it's just a simple, am I going to mute or am I going to unmute during choral responses? So one general tip, hopefully that was helpful for you as you thought about that group. And then thinking about that same group, select one of the key activities from your intervention program. So something from your phonological awareness section of the lesson, from your phonic decoding section, or from your connected text section. And what's one specific tip that you'll use to present your instruction for that activity virtually? Maybe you really just like that simplistic phoneme deletion template I showed and you want to use that. If so, terrific. Hopefully there's something here that you can take away and use with your reading groups. I did want to point out, recently Reading Rockets highlighted a case study. And this case study was a teacher who was working with a first grade student who had a diagnosis of dyslexia and significant reading difficulty. And this teacher was presenting a multisensory reading lesson virtually. And she kind of describes some of the modifications she makes. And so this case study was originally posted on a site called educatingalllearners.org, and again was highlighted through Reading Rockets recently. And I just wanted to share that with you in case you wanted to check that out and see how this teacher adapted her lesson so she could teach it virtually. And then finally, in terms of what's next, we definitely encourage you to reach out to us about your successes and challenges as you're working, most of you in virtual classrooms, and provide us some feedback regarding this presentation's content. So how's it going this year? What are your experiences with teaching reading to students who experience word reading difficulties? How's the remote instruction going? What assistance do you need? We would love to feature your scenario in a mini case study, a data study, or in an upcoming blog on CORE's website. And I wanted also to point out to you that CORE has a number of wonderful free resources for you available on our website. Just one thing I'll highlight is that we have curated and created a word reading difficulties resource library for you. You'll see the link on our home site, and the link is also, or on our homepage, and the link is also here on the slide. And this library includes everything from infographics to articles to recorded webinars from reading experts. You name it, wonderful links to other sites. So take a look. I'm sure you'll find something that will be a valuable resource to you in your work. And also just wanted to let you know that we are here for you if you are needing support on site or wanting some training on the science of reading, that CORE is here to support you. Our educational consultants will work with your team to address your site's specific goals, your specific challenges, and capacity building needs around ELA as well as math. So feel free to reach out to us via our website, via Twitter or Facebook, or you can reach out to me via email, and my email is provided here. We will be providing today's slide deck as also as a download, so hopefully you can utilize this information again as a reference and as a resource to help you as you are teaching more and more of your lessons virtually. Thanks so much for participating in the session.